So we're now going to turn our attention to discussing key error handling operators in the observable class. If you recall our discussion of Java completable futures, I talked about how handling errors in asynchronous contexts is more complicated than handling them in synchronous contexts because the caller may have gone away by the time an error is actually detected and an exception is thrown. And so therefore, we're going to have some operators defined in the observable class that'll handle errors that occur asynchronously or potentially asynchronously in an observable chain. And those methods we're going to look at are onErrorReturn and onErrorResumeNext. So let's start out by taking a look at onErrorReturn. This will end the flow in the chain with the last item returned by the function that's passed as a parameter. And the function that's passed is a function, much like the Java function, although RxJava was done before Java 8 came out, so they had to make their own classes that do what we would get with Java 8 functions and suppliers and consumers and so on. But that's really neither here nor there. The function parameter here returns one value that will be emitted along with the regular onComplete signal if the current observable signals an onError event. So the way to think about this is it's going to adapt or transform the behavior. And it basically returns a new observable that falls back to this thing called the item supplier on an error. So if an error occurs in the stream, and it happens to be the one that's designated here as being catchable as this throwable, which is the root of exceptions in Java, then we'll replace the error with the value of item supplier. This operator also has another interesting characteristic. It swallows the exception, so it doesn't propagate up the call chain or the call stack any further. And this is a typical property known as error hiding. We don't let the errors propagate out of scope. In fact, what we're doing here is we're changing an error into whatever return value we want as the fallback. Here's a simple example of this, and we'll take a look at this when we look at the case study here. This particular example is going to try to generate a big fraction that takes in a random numerator and then some denominator that we're going to give it and we can control. And occasionally, we're going to give it the denominator of 0. And as you can imagine, when you try to create a big fraction that has a 0 denominator, it doesn't like that very much, so it throws the arithmetic exception. And what we are going to do here is, even though we're running this computation in a background thread out of the computation thread pool, we're going to set up an error handler that, when the arithmetic exception occurs, is going to return a 0 instead of letting the exception propagate up that chain. So then we'll end up multiplying the value by a 0, which may not give you a very sensible result, but it's probably better than crashing your program. Project Reactor has a flux operator called onErrorResume that works the same as onErrorReturn. Not quite sure why they chose to use different names there. As usual, it's a bit of a mystery. And the Java completable future method exceptionally is very similar to onErrorResume and onErrorReturn. Let's talk now about another operator that handles errors that's defined in RxJava. And this is called onErrorResumeNext. And what it does is it'll resume the flow instead of signaling an error via onError. But it behaves a little bit different than onErrorReturn. What's passed in here is a function that chooses the fallback depending on the type of error. Once again, the error type is passed in as the first parameter to the function, and it returns this thing called an observable source. And the type of error is a subclass of throwable. So you can basically check. You can do a downcast to see what kind of error it was, if you care enough to care about that. What onErrorResumeNext returns is an observable that will return an observable source, namely this guy here, that will take over if the current observable encounters an error. So if an error occurs, then we're going to let the observable source decide what to do. As with onErrorReturn, onErrorResumeNext will also swallow the exception so it doesn't propagate up the call chain any further. Again, there's kind of a blessing and a curse to doing that, but this is just telling you what mechanisms exist. So here's a very interesting example that we'll also take a look at. This time what we're going to do is when an error occurs, like if we try to divide by 0, by having a 0 in the denominator of our big fraction, we're going to use onErrorResumeNext. And what that's going to do is it's going to return an empty observable. And that just basically says, I'm done. Anything else that came after this will be ignored, but I'm not going to crash. I'm just going to ignore all the results that came after that point. And again, you could do other things. This is just returning an empty observable. Project Reactor Flux has something that works very much the same as this. And Java Completable Future exceptionally is also very similar as well. So that's the end of the discussion of error handling operators in the observable class. I should hasten to point out that even with these mechanisms, it's still tricky to deal with errors in an asynchronous environment. But this at least gives you a fighting chance to handle them in a systematic way.